The gun pressed cold and deliberate against the back of Levi Zachary's neck, and the man holding it had the kind of eyes that had already decided the outcome. "You should have stayed out of it," Garrett Holt said, his voice smooth as creek water over stone. "Both of you." Adelaide Zachary, she had only been Adelaide Zachary for 6 hours, stood 3 feet away, her wrists bound to the post of the old telegraph station, her wedding dress torn at the shoulder where Holt's man had grabbed her. She was not crying. Levi had learned enough about her in the past 3 weeks to know she would not give Holt the satisfaction of tears, but her eyes were wide and dark and fixed on Levi's face like she was trying to memorize it. "You went and married her," Holt continued, almost conversational, circling so that the gun moved from Levi's neck to his temple. "That was stupid. I had plans for that woman, big plans. And you walked into my plans the same way a mule walks into a fence, all noise and no sense." Levi's jaw was tight. His hands were at his sides. He could feel the weight of his holster, but Holt's second man, the one with the broken nose that had been broken a second time by Levi's fist only 20 minutes ago, had already relieved him of his Colt peacemaker. "If you hurt her," Levi said, his voice low and even, "there is no corner of this territory where you will sleep again." Holt laughed, and it echoed off the dry adobe walls of the telegraph station. Outside, the New Mexico wind was blowing hard, the kind of late October wind that carried sand and cold in equal measure. The year was 1882, and the town of Rosalie Flats had not seen law enforcement since the sheriff had been run out of the county by Holt's money 3 months prior. "Bold talk for a man with a gun to his head," Holt said. Adelaide's voice cut through the room. "Let him go." Both men looked at her. "He has nothing to do with this," she said. "This is between you and me and what you did to my father. Let Levi go." Her voice did not shake. That detail would stay with Levi for the rest of his life. The memory of her standing there in a torn wedding dress with her hands bound and her chin lifted, as though she were the one holding all the power in the room. Because the truth was, even then, she was. Holt's expression shifted into something uglier. "You're right," he said slowly. "It is about your father, and about what your father left behind, and about the fact that you've been running around this territory trying to expose me when you should have been quiet and cooperative." "I will never be cooperative with you," Adelaide said. Holt moved the gun away from Levi's temple and aimed it at Adelaide. The entire world seemed to stop. 3 weeks earlier, the sun had been doing what the New Mexico sun did best in early October of 1882, which was burning everything it touched with the particular contempt of something that had been there long before any human had dared to build a life beneath it. Levi Zachary was mending the eastern fence line of his property, the Zachary Ranch, which sat on 400 acres of dry grass and red rock 8 miles outside of Rosalie Flats. He was 31 years old, lean and broad-shouldered in the way of men who have worked land since they could walk, with calloused hands and a quiet face that people often mistook for coldness until he spoke. He had been working the ranch alone for 2 years, since his older brother Thomas had gone east for reasons that were complicated and painful and rarely discussed. The fence post he was working on was stubborn, the ground too dry and hard, and he was so focused on driving the post that he almost did not hear the horse. Almost. The animal came over the ridge at a slow, limping gait, and the rider on its back was hunched forward in a way that told Levi, before he even saw her face, that something was badly wrong. He dropped the post driver and walked quickly toward the ridge, and as the horse descended the shallow slope, he could see that the rider was a woman, young, maybe 25, 26, with dark auburn hair that had come loose from its pins and dried blood at her temple. She did not see him until the horse stopped, apparently deciding that it had done enough for one day. The woman raised her head and looked at Levy with eyes that were brown and sharp, even through whatever pain she was carrying. She did not look frightened. She looked exhausted and determined in a combination Levy would come to know as her defining characteristic. "Your horse is lame," he said, because it was the most immediately practical thing. "I know," she said. "She stepped in a hole about 4 miles back. I've been walking her slowly." She looked around at the fence line, at the red rock and dry grass, at the ranch house visible in the distance. "Is this private land?" "It is," Levy said. "It's mine. Levy Zachary." She studied him for a moment with an assessment that was not unfriendly but was thoroughly thorough. "Adelaide Voss," she said. "I apologize for trespassing. I was trying to reach Rosalie Flats and I must have gone off the main road." "The main road washed out in the rains last month," Levy said. "Nobody's fixed it yet. You weren't wrong, you just didn't know." He moved to the horse's side and ran his hand gently down the mare's left foreleg, feeling the heat and swelling around the fetlock. The horse turned her head and looked at him with patient, suffering eyes. "She needs rest and cool compresses. She can't be ridden for at least a week." Adelaide closed her eyes briefly, a single, controlled exhale. "A week," she repeated. "I've got a spare stall," Levy said, "and a spare room if you need somewhere to stay while she heals. My housekeeper, Mrs. Acaffer, is there. I say that so you know it's a respectable offer." Adelaide opened her eyes and looked at him. There was something behind the assessment now, something that was trying to decide whether to trust. He could see it working in her face. "You always help strangers?" she asked. The question was genuine, not rhetorical. She actually wanted to know. Levy considered it for only a second. "Only the ones I plan to marry," he said. The words came out before he had entirely thought them through. He was not a man who said things like that. He was not a man who joked easily or spoke carelessly. And yet the words had come as naturally as breathing, as though some part of him had already understood something that the rest of him would need 3 weeks to catch up to. Adelaide stared at him. Then, for the first time, she almost smiled. "Not quite, but almost." "That is an extremely forward thing to say to a woman you met 30 seconds ago," she said. "I know it," Levy said. "I apologize. Help me get your horse down to the stable and we'll forget I said it." She did not forget. He did not forget. But they moved to the stable, and that was how it began. Mrs. Amara Acaffer was a tall, formidably practical woman of 52 who had come to work for Levy 2 years prior after her husband had died, and her children had gone to California. She ran the Zachary ranch house with the kind of quiet efficiency that made everything look effortless, and gave absolutely nothing away about the effort involved. She took one look at Adelaide Voss when Levy brought her through the back door, assessed the blood at her temple, the torn sleeve, the bone-deep exhaustion, and said, "Sit down and stop pretending you're fine." Adelaide sat down at the kitchen table with the expression of someone who had been seen through, and was not entirely sure how to feel about it. "Mrs. Acaffer cleaned the cut at her temple shallow, from a fall rather than a blow," Adelaide explained when her horse had first stumbled, and made strong coffee and said nothing more until she set the cup down in front of Adelaide and folded her arms. "Where are you coming from?" she asked. "Santa Fe," Adelaide said. "Before that, St. Louis." "Long way," Mrs. Acaffer observed. "Yes," Adelaide agreed. Levy sat across the table and said nothing. He had learned early in his life that silence was one of the most useful things a person could offer, and he offered it now, watching Adelaide wrap both hands around the coffee cup and stare into it as though it contained something she was trying to read. "My father died 4 months ago," she said finally, "in Rosalie Flats, The official report said it was a heart attack. She paused. It was not a heart attack. Levy and Mrs. Acaffer exchanged a glance. My father was Edmund Voss, Adelaide continued. He was a land surveyor. He spent the last year of his life surveying parcels in this county for the territorial government. He found something. I don't know exactly what. His letters to me were careful. He was always careful. But in his last letter, he told me that he had documented evidence of something illegal being done with the land records. He said there was a man involved, someone powerful and connected, and that he was going to take what he had found to the territorial authorities in Santa Fe. She lifted her eyes to Levy. They were steady. They were also, he realized, the most honest eyes he had ever seen. There was nothing performed in her grief, no theater to it. It was just a clean, hard, real pain. He died 2 weeks after he wrote that letter, she said, before he could reach Santa Fe. And when I came to claim his effects and ask questions, I was told politely but very firmly that Edmund Voss had died of a heart attack, that there was no investigation, and that I should go home to St. Louis. But you didn't go home, Levy said. I went to Santa Fe first, she said. His contact there, a man named Holloway in the surveying office, told me my father had never arrived. But he also told me that 2 weeks before my father died, a large parcel of land in Colfax County had been quietly transferred to a holding company, and that the surveying records for that parcel had been altered. He showed me copies. The alterations were not subtle once you knew what to look for. Who owns the holding company? Mrs. Acaffer asked. Adelaide set down her coffee cup. A man named Garrett Holt. The name landed in the kitchen with a specific gravity. Levy put both hands flat on the table. You know him, Adelaide said, reading his reaction instantly. Everyone in this county knows Garrett Holt, Levy said carefully. He's been buying land in this region for 3 years. He runs a trading company out of Rosalie Flats, but the trading company is what he shows people. What he actually runs is more complicated. He paused. He also had the sheriff removed from office in August. Or that's the story. Nobody has been able to prove it. Adelaide nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something she had already suspected. My father's evidence is somewhere in Rosalie Flats, she said. In his rented room at the Conover Hotel. He kept copies of everything always. I need to get there and find it before Holt's people do. Holt's people may already know you're coming, Levy said. Probably, Adelaide said, and she said it without flinching. That's why I came cross-country instead of on the main road. I was trying to approach the town quietly. Instead, I lost the road and my horse went lame. She exhaled. My father always said my plans were better in concept than execution. There was a brief silence, and then Mrs. Acaffer said, You'll sleep tonight and eat a proper meal, and then we'll talk about what comes next, in a tone that suggested this was not a suggestion. Adelaide looked at her, and something in her expression softened. Thank you, she said, and it was the most unguarded thing she had said since she had arrived. She slept 12 hours. When she came down to breakfast the next morning, wearing a clean dress Mrs. Acaffer had produced from somewhere, and with her hair properly pinned, she looked like a different person and also entirely the same person. The sharpness was all still there, the determination. But underneath it, Levy could see now that she was also simply a woman who had lost her father and had not allowed herself to fully feel it yet, because she was too busy trying to get justice for him. He understood that. He had carried his own grief at a distance for long enough to recognize the shape of it in someone else. They ate breakfast, and he asked her questions about the land records, and she answered with a precision and detail that told him she had been doing her homework for months. She knew surveyors' language, legal terminology, the structure of territorial land grants. Her father had been a surveyor, and she had clearly spent her childhood absorbing everything he knew. "You're not a helpless woman who stumbled into something over her head," Levy said, between the biscuits and the coffee. Adelaide looked at him with an expression that was something between exasperated and amused. "Did you think I was?" "I wasn't sure what you were," he said honestly. "I'm starting to understand." "And what am I?" she asked, and it was a real question, not a coy one. "Dangerous," he said. "In the best possible way." She held his gaze for a moment, and something shifted between them, something that was not quite comfortable and not quite uncomfortable. Something electric and new. Mrs. Ackaffer set another biscuit on Levy's plate and said nothing, but the expression on her face was the expression of a woman who had opinions. The plan, such as it was Levy's idea and Adelaide's refinement. Rosalie Flats was a small town, and a woman arriving alone and asking questions about Edmund Voss was going to attract exactly the kind of attention they did not want. But a rancher who had legitimate business in town, supplies, feed orders, a meeting at the land office, was unremarkable. And a woman traveling with him as his cousin, visiting from St. Louis, was similarly unremarkable. "Your cousin," Adelaide repeated. "It's the most believable family resemblance," Levy said. "We don't look similar enough for siblings." Adelaide studied his face with that same thorough assessment. Brown hair, gray eyes, a jaw that had seen too much sun. She supposed he was right that they did not look like siblings. She also supposed she was noticing his face more carefully than the task of assessing a fictional family resemblance strictly required, and she set that thought aside. "Cousin is fine," she said. They rode into Rosalie Flats 2 days later, once Adelaide's mare had been properly seen to and was settled comfortably in Levy's stable. He had spent the evening before the ride doing what he always did when he was thinking hard about something, which was fixing things. He repaired 2 sections of the barn roof, reshod the horse he intended to take into town, and sharpened every blade in the tool shed. Adelaide found him in the tool shed around sunset and watched him work without comment for a while. "You're worried," she said eventually. "I'm careful," he said, running the whetstone along the edge of a hatchet. "There's a difference." "Is there?" He set the hatchet down and looked at her. The sun was going down behind the red rocks, and the light was orange and long, and it did something to her hair that he was not going to describe to himself, because that direction of thinking was not productive. "Holt is not a man who makes mistakes," he said. "He has money, and he has connections, and he has people who do things for him that he doesn't need to get his own hands dirty for. If he had your father killed, and I think you might be right that he did it in a way that left no trace and no witnesses. Going up against that kind of man requires more than evidence. It requires the right people to give the evidence to." "I have a contact in Santa Fe," Adelaide said. "Holloway, the man I mentioned. He knows a federal land commissioner who is not connected to the territorial establishment here. If I can get the original documents my father hid, I can get them to the commissioner. And Holt, there's enough in those documents, according to what Holloway told me, to bring federal charges. Fraud, forgery of government land records, and depending on what else my father found." She paused. "Possibly conspiracy in connection with his death." Levy was quiet for a moment. "Your father sounds like he was a brave man." Adelaide's jaw tightened briefly. "He was," she said. "He believed that a person had a responsibility to stand up for what was right even when it cost something. He used to say that justice was not something that happened to people. It was something people chose. A beat." "I chose. I can see that," Levy said. She looked at him, and in the fading orange light he could see something complicated and real and undefended in her expression for just a moment before she pulled it back. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "Truly, you have a ranch, a good life. Holt has nothing to do with you." Levy considered the honest answer and then gave it. "He might," he said. "There are parcels to the north of my land that the holding company has been acquiring. I've been watching it. If the records were being falsified the way you're describing, some of those parcels may have been taken from families who held legitimate claims." He paused. "And because what happened to your father was wrong. And because you rode onto my land bleeding and alone and still more worried about your horse than yourself. And that says something about a person." The silence that followed was the kind that was fuller than most conversations. "Cousin," Adelaide said finally, with something that was close to a real smile. "Right." Rosalie Flats in October of 1882 was a town doing its best to look stable while everything under the surface moved like water before a flood. It had a main street of beaten earth, a general store, a hotel, a saloon, a small church with a missing bell, a telegraph station, a land office, and the offices of Holt Trading Company, which occupied the largest building on the street and had recently received a fresh coat of paint. The Conover Hotel was a two-story wooden building midway down the main street. Its proprietor was a small, nervous man named Silas Conover, who had inherited it from his father, and seemed to regard its daily operation as a series of potential disasters narrowly avoided. He looked at Levy when they arrived with the expression of a man who recognized him. Levy had stayed at the hotel before, on supply runs, and then looked at Adelaide with an expression that mixed curiosity and something else, something more careful. "My cousin," Levy said. "Adelaide Voss. She's visiting from St. Louis." Silas Conover's expression did not change exactly, but something in it did. A small tightening. A recognition that he was trying to keep off his face and not entirely succeeding. He knows the name, Levy realized. He knows who she is. "Welcome to Rosalie Flats," Silas said, in a voice that was pleasant and entirely hollow. "We have rooms available. How long will you be staying?" "2 nights, perhaps 3, Adelaide said, with the serene confidence of someone who had been a stranger in strange places before. They were shown to separate rooms on the second floor. The moment Silas's footsteps had descended the stairs, Adelaide opened Levy's door. She had knocked so lightly he had barely heard it and stepped inside without ceremony. "He recognized my name," she said immediately. "I saw it," Levy said. "My father stayed here for 2 months before he died. Conover knew him." She moved to the window and looked down at the street, keeping back from the glass so she was not visible from below. "The question is whether Conover is afraid of Holt or working for him." "Could be both," Levy said. "It could." She turned from the window. "My father's room was number 6. His effects were supposed to have been packed and held here after he died, pending my arrival to collect them. I need to search them tonight." "Conover will have been through them already," Levy said. "Almost certainly." "But my father was clever. He knew how to hide things." She paused. "He had a system. When I was a child traveling with him on survey jobs, he used to hide small valuables inside the spine of whatever book he was currently reading. He would slit the inner spine slightly and slip papers inside. No one ever looks in the spine of a book." She almost smiled again. "I've been thinking about it the whole ride here. He always had a book." They waited until well after midnight. The hotel was quiet. The town was quiet. The wind off the desert was not quiet, but it was consistent enough to cover the soft sounds of movement. Levy kept watch at the end of the corridor while Adelaide used the skeleton key she had brought. She had done her preparation thoroughly, to open the door of room 6. The room was empty of a person, but still held a battered trunk in the corner, sealed with a cheap padlock. Adelaide had the lock open in under a minute using 2 hairpins in a technique she acknowledged she had learned from a locksmith in St. Louis who had owed her father a favor. Levy watched from the corridor and updated his already considerable assessment of her. Inside the trunk, folded clothes, surveying tools, a compass, a worn leather notebook, and 3 books. She took out all 3 books and ran her fingers down each spine in turn. The third one, a well-worn copy of a natural history compendium, gave slightly under her fingers at the lower spine. She looked up at Levy, and her expression in the thin light from the corridor was bright and fierce and grieving all at once. She worked the spine open carefully and slid out a folded set of papers. 5 pages, closely written in a small, precise hand, covered with notations, parcel numbers, dates, names. She pressed them against her chest for just a moment. "He kept them safe," she whispered, "all the way to the end." "Put them inside your dress," Levy said quietly, practically. "We need to move." She did. They locked the trunk, relocked the room, and were back in their respective rooms within 4 minutes of leaving them. Levy lay on the narrow hotel bed with his boots on and his ears open and did not sleep for the rest of the night. He was thinking about Adelaide Voss pressing those papers to her chest in the dark, and about her father who had been brave enough to die for what was right, and about the fact that he had said something ridiculous to a bleeding stranger on the edge of his fence line 3 days ago, and was beginning to understand that it had been less ridiculous than it had seemed. They left the hotel early the next morning before Silas Conover was visibly about, and went to the general store on the pretext of Levy's supply needs. While Levy arranged his order with the store's proprietor, Adelaide took the papers out behind the counter where she had maneuvered herself, under the pretext of examining the bolts of fabric, and read them properly for the first time in daylight. What she found made her go very still. Levy noticed. He finished with the store's proprietor, agreed to collect his order in an hour, and walked to where she was standing by the fabric bolts. She handed him the papers without a word, and he read them with the same stillness spreading across his face. The falsified parcels numbered 17. The original claim holders, small ranchers, a mining family, 2 homesteading families, a Jicarilla Apache community that had been in that valley for 3 generations, had all been displaced through fabricated debt claims and forged deeds. The Zachary Ranch's northern boundary parcels were on the list, 2 of them. There it was. "He's been taking land from everyone," Adelaide said quietly, "from families who had nothing else, including from people who had been here long before any of us," Levy said, thinking of the Jicarilla. He had had good neighbors to his north for years. He had noticed the valley going quiet, the familiar smoke from cooking fires absent. He had not investigated, and he felt the weight of that now. "This goes beyond my father," Adelaide said. "This is larger." "Yes," Levy said. "Holloway's contact Commissioner Aldridge in Santa Fe. He needs to see this," she said. "These original documents with my father's notations, they're proof enough for a federal investigation." "There's a telegraph station here," Levy said, "but Holt will have eyes on it." "I know." She folded the papers carefully back against her person and looked up at him. Her brown eyes were very clear, very direct. "I need to get these to Santa Fe in person. I can't trust a telegraph for the substance of it. I need to ride." "Your horse is still at my ranch," Levy said. "She needs another 5 days at minimum." "Can you spare a horse?" He looked at her. "I can spare 2 horses," he said. "One for you and one for me, because you are not riding to Santa Fe alone with those papers." Adelaide opened her mouth as though she intended to argue and then closed it. "You've already been more involved in this than is safe for you," she said. "I told you," Levy said. "Some of those parcels are on my northern boundary. This is my business too." He paused. and I don't want anything to happen to you." He said the last part plainly, without ornamentation, because he was not an ornamental person. She looked at him for a long moment with that same complicated thing in her expression that he had seen at sunset in the tool shed. "All right," she said. They went back to the Zachary ranch that afternoon, and over supper Levy explained the plan to Mrs. Acaffer, who listened without interrupting, which was her habit. When he finished, she said, "I'll pack food for the road," and got up from the table, which was her way of expressing agreement and concern simultaneously. Adelaide wrote a careful letter to Holloway in Santa Fe that evening, describing what she had found and asking him to have Commissioner Aldridge prepared to receive her. Levy rode to the neighboring Henderson ranch 6 miles west and asked old Frank Henderson, who was nobody's informant, to carry the letter to the Santa Fe Post Road in the morning. Frank Henderson, who had known Levy since childhood and had his own reasons to distrust Garrett Holt. One of those 17 parcels had been a Henderson cousin's land, agreed without hesitation. They were supposed to leave for Santa Fe at first light. They were not supposed to find 2 of Holt's men waiting in the yard when Levy came out of the barn at 5 in the morning. The men were not armed in a visible way, which was worse than if they had been openly threatening, because it meant the threat was underneath the surface and deniable. The taller of the 2, a man with a trimmed beard and cold, flat eyes that Levy recognized as belonging to a man named Dawes who ran errands for Holt, tipped his hat and smiled pleasantly. "Mr. Zachary," he said, "Mr. Holt sends his regards. He wondered if he might have a word with your house guest." "She's not receiving visitors," Levy said. "Mr. Holt is an important man in this county," Dawes said. "It would be discourteous to refuse." "I'll be discourteous then," Levy said. Dawes's pleasant expression did not change, but his eyes did. "It would be in everyone's best interest," he said carefully, "for certain misunderstandings to be cleared up. The young woman has apparently been asking questions about a land matter that was settled legally and above board. Mr. Holt simply wants to clarify that fact. The young woman is my guest," Levy said, "and she is free to ask any questions she likes. Tell Mr. Holt that." A pause. The second man, shorter and broader, shifted his weight. "You might want to think carefully," Dawes said, and the pleasant tone was gone now, replaced by something flat and factual. "Before you make yourself part of this." "I'm already part of this," Levy said. "Good morning." He walked back into the house without hurrying. The moment the door was closed and he could not be seen from the yard, he moved quickly, telling Adelaide and Mrs. Acaffer in 20 rapid words what had happened. Mrs. Acaffer took the shotgun from its place beside the kitchen door and stood where she could see both the front and back approaches. Adelaide was already in her traveling clothes, her face calm with the particular calm of someone who had known this moment was coming. "They'll follow us on the road to Santa Fe," she said. "Yes," Levy said. "So we don't take the main road," Adelaide said. "No," he agreed. "We take the old Comanche Trail north through the mesa, then east around the Galenas. It adds half a day, but it goes through terrain that's harder to track in." Adelaide nodded. "When do we leave?" "Right now," Levy said. They were on horses and away from the ranch within 15 minutes, Levy on his big bay and Adelaide on the spare roan that was steady and strong enough for mountain terrain. Mrs. Acaffer stood at the fence and watched them go with an expression that Levy understood completely. He had seen her pray before, quickly and without ceremony, when things were serious, and he saw her lips moving now as she watched them ride north. The Comanche Trail was not really a trail anymore. It was a memory of a trail, the kind of path that existed mainly because the land itself had been traveled so many times over so many centuries that it retained the knowledge of passage in its rock and dust. Levy had ridden it twice before, once following stray cattle and once out of pure curiosity about the mesa country. And he was glad now for both those times, because the terrain required confidence and confidence required familiarity. They rode hard through the morning, through country that was stark and vast and heartbreakingly beautiful in the way of things that do not care whether they are beautiful or not. Red rock and sage and the occasional cry of a hawk. The sky was enormous and blue and indifferent. Around midday, when they stopped to water the horses at a small canyon spring, Adelaide sat down on a flat rock and ate the food Mrs. Acaffer had packed, dried beef and hard bread and 2 boiled eggs, packed with the matter-of-fact tenderness that was Mrs. Acaffer's signature, and was quiet for a long time. Levy sat nearby and did not push. He watched a lizard move across the rock between them with the unhurried confidence of something that had been doing this for 1,000,000 years. "I keep thinking about the families on that list," Adelaide said. "The ones who lost their land. They may not even know it was fraud. They may think they lost it through bad luck or debt, the way people always lose things." "Some of them probably do know," Levy said. "Knowing and being able to prove it or do anything about it are different things." "My father knew that difference," Adelaide said. "He spent his whole life as a surveyor watching what happened to land, who got to keep it and who didn't. He was always careful to do his work honestly even when he was asked not to be." She paused. "There were other surveyors who did what Holt asked and were well paid for it. My father refused twice, and the second time they stopped hiring him for county work. He took private commissions after that." A silence. "He found what Holt was doing by accident during a private commission that happened to overlap with one of the falsified parcels. He couldn't let it go." "He sounds like you," Levy said. Adelaide looked at him. "What do you mean?" "The part about not being able to let it go even when it would have been easier and safer." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My mother used to say that my father and I were 2 of the same coin. Too stubborn to step around an injustice, too principled to pretend we hadn't seen it." She said it with love, a beat. "She died when I was 16. After that it was just my father and me." "That's a lot of loss," Levy said. "Yes," she agreed simply. "Is it just you and your ranch now? You mentioned a brother." He was surprised she had held that detail. "My brother Thomas," he said. "He went east 2 years ago. We had a disagreement about the ranch, about whether to sell part of the northern land when times were hard. I said no, and he said the practical thing was to sell, and we were both right in our own way, but we were both also too proud to say that, so he left instead." He paused. "I've written," he's replied. "It's getting better slowly." "Family is complicated," Adelaide said. "The most complicated thing there is," Levy agreed. She handed him one of the boiled eggs without being asked, because she had apparently noticed he had been too preoccupied in the morning rush to take enough food. He accepted it with a quiet nod, and they ate in the companionable silence of people who have been through something together, and do not need to fill every moment with words. They rode east through the afternoon, and made camp that night in a shallow canyon where the rock walls held the day's heat, and the stars above were ridiculous in their abundance, the kind of sky that only existed far from any town's lights. Levy made a small fire and Adelaide sat across from him and wrote in a small notebook she kept in her traveling bag, adding notes to what she had read in her father's papers. "I want to understand everything in there before I meet with Aldridge," she said, "so I can answer every question. So there's no gap that Holt's lawyers can get into." "You've thought about this like a legal case," Levy observed. "I had to," she said. "I knew from the beginning that if I went at this emotionally, as a grieving daughter rather than as someone presenting documented evidence, no one would take it seriously." She glanced up from the notebook. Women with grief are a tragedy. Women with documented evidence and legal understanding are an inconvenience to very powerful men. I decided to be the second kind. Both at the same time, it seems like, Levy said. She looked at him steadily. Yes, she said. Both, always both. She looked back at her notebook. My father would have liked you, she added quietly without looking up. Levy did not say anything. He fed a small piece of wood to the fire and watched the sparks rise into the enormous New Mexico night, and felt something in his chest that he had not felt in a long time, the particular warmth of being known by someone. The beginning of it, at least. They reached Santa Fe on the morning of the third day, tired and dusty and entirely intact, which Levy counted as a victory. The city was louder and busier than anything either of them had experienced in weeks, full of traders and wagons, and the multi-layered sound of a territorial capital going about its complicated business. Holloway, the man at the surveying office, was a careful, nervous, well-meaning man of 40, who had been quietly terrified for months about what he knew and deeply relieved to see Adelaide walking through his office door alive, and in possession of her father's original documents. He sat with them for 2 hours and studied the papers, and then sent word to Commissioner Aldridge. The meeting with Aldridge happened that same afternoon, in a solid stone building that smelled of old paper and authority. Commissioner Aldridge was a compact, gray-haired, deliberate man who had seen a great many land fraud schemes in his career, and had the particular stillness of someone who has learned not to react prematurely to anything. He read Edmund Voss's papers carefully, asked Adelaide questions for an hour, asked Levy 2 specific questions about his northern boundary parcels and what he had observed, and then sat back and was quiet for a long moment. This is sufficient for a federal warrant, he said finally. More than sufficient. These records, combined with what Holloway has already provided me, constitute a clear case of systematic fraud in violation of federal land laws. He paused. And the circumstances of your father's death will be examined. I cannot promise you an outcome, Miss Voss, but I promise you it will be examined properly this time. Adelaide received this with the stillness of someone who has been waiting for a very long time for a single sentence and now has it. Levy watched her and saw the grief and the relief exist simultaneously in her face for a moment before she controlled her expression. Thank you, Commissioner, she said. Your father did this county a service, Aldridge said, simply and seriously. I intend to see that it means something. They left the building in the late afternoon into a Santa Fe street loud with carts and commerce, and Adelaide stopped on the wooden sidewalk and stood very still for a moment. Levy stood beside her. You all right? She took a breath. Exhaled. I've been running toward this moment for 4 months, she said. I didn't think about what would happen when I got here. What does happen? He asked. She turned to look at him. She was standing close enough that he could see the specific color of her eyes in the afternoon light. Not plain brown, but warm brown with threads of amber, the kind of color that required more than one look to understand properly. I don't know, she said honestly. I have my father's justice in motion. I have no clear plan beyond that. You could come back to Rosalie Flats, Levy said. He kept his voice neutral, which required some effort. There will need to be someone there to cooperate with the federal inquiry when it arrives. Aldridge will need a local presence he trusts. That's a practical argument, she said. I have other arguments, he said, but I'm trying to be practical first. She looked at him for a long moment. What are the other arguments? She asked. He held her gaze. You know what the other arguments are, he said, a pause. The Santa Fe street moved around them, a horse cart, 2 men arguing about a price, the smell of pinon smoke from somewhere nearby, and none of it touched them. "You said something to me when we first met," Adelaide said. "Something forward and unplanned." "I remember," he said. "Did you mean it?" she asked. "Or was it the kind of thing a person says in a strange moment?" Levy was quiet for just a second. Then he said, "I don't say things I don't mean. I've meant most of it since about an hour after I met you, and I've meant all of it since the night in that hotel corridor when you came out of your father's room holding those papers." She held his gaze. Something in her expression was softening at its edges, the long tension of 4 months of fear and grief and determined forward motion beginning, very slowly, to ease. "I need time," she said. "Not a long time, but some time." "I have time," Levy said. "I have a ranch and a very opinionated housekeeper, and a lot of fence to mend and nowhere I need to be except where I am." She almost laughed. Almost. They stayed 2 nights in Santa Fe, at separate boarding houses within 2 blocks of each other, which was proper and which neither of them spent very much time thinking about as a permanent state of affairs. During those 2 days, Aldridge moved quickly, more quickly than Adelaide had expected, issuing a federal warrant and dispatching a federal marshal named Tate, who was based in Albuquerque, and had a reputation for being unmovable by money or threats. Adelaide also, during those 2 days, did something she had been avoiding for 4 months. She went to the small Catholic church 2 streets from the boarding house, and she sat in the cool stone quiet for an hour, and she grieved her father properly. Not with performance, not with calculation, not with the controlled management of emotion that had gotten her here. Just a daughter and her grief and the silence of a stone room. When she came out, Levy was sitting on the church's front steps. He had not known she was going there. He had been walking past and seen her go in. He did not say anything. He had brought coffee from the shop across the street, 2 cups, and he handed her one when she sat down next to him on the steps. "He would have been proud of you," Levy said. Adelaide looked at the cup in her hands. "I know," she said. "He would have also told me to eat something and stop driving myself into the ground." A pause. He was very practical for a principled man. "Sounds familiar," Levy said. She looked at him sideways, and this time she actually smiled. Not almost. Actually. It transformed her face. Not into something different, but into a fuller version of what it already was. They rode back to Rosalie Flats 3 days later. They went by the main road this time, because the federal warrant meant that Holt's men watching the roads were now a different kind of problem for Holt than they were for Levy and Adelaide. The news traveled ahead of them, as news did in small territories. By the time they rode into Rosalie Flats, Garrett Holt already knew about the federal warrant. What he did not know, what no one knew yet, was what he would do about it. What he did was something faster and more desperate than Levy had anticipated. He sent Dawes to the Zachary Ranch with a message. The message said that Holt wished to discuss a resolution, that certain arrangements could be made that would satisfy everyone, and that Miss Voss should come to his offices at the Holt Trading Company to discuss matters privately. Adelaide read the message and looked at Levy. "He wants to buy me off," she said. "Or he wants you somewhere he controls," Levy said. "Don't go." "I'm not going," she said. "I'm not that naive." But Holt, it turned out, had a second plan that he had been developing simultaneously, which was characteristic of the kind of man who had gotten as far as he had. The second plan involved a piece of information that Dawes had obtained from Silas Conover at the hotel, who had been watching things with his nervous, frightened eyes and reporting them since the moment Adelaide had arrived. What Conover had seen was a woman and a rancher who were clearly more than cousins. What Conover had concluded was that the one leverage point Adelaide Voss had not thought to protect was Levy Zachary. They had been back at the ranch for 2 days when Adelaide came to Levy in the evening with an expression he had not seen on her face before, which was something close to fear. Not for herself. "There was a man in the general store today," she said, "when I rode in for supplies. He followed me to the counter and said something quietly so no one else would hear." Levy waited. He said that Holt had information suggesting that Levy Zachary had interfered with official proceedings and aided in the theft of private documents. He said that Mr. Holt would not pursue this charge if I agreed to meet with him. She paused. "It was a fabricated charge. I know it was fabricated. But I also know that without a sheriff in this county and with Holt's connections in the territorial government, a fabricated charge against you is not nothing." Levy sat with this for a moment. "He's using me to get to you," he said. "Yes," she said. "That was always going to be his move once the warrant was issued," Levy said. "He couldn't threaten you directly without making himself look worse to the federal inquiry, so he threatens through me." Adelaide looked at him with that expression that was fear but also something fiercer beneath it. "I am not going to meet with him," she said. "I am also not going to let you bear a false charge because of me." "Adelaide," Levy said. "No," she said. "Don't tell me this isn't my fault because we both know it is, and that's not the point. The point is that I brought this to your door and I need to." "Adelaide," he said again, more quietly this time. She stopped. "Marshal Tate arrives in 4 days," Levy said. "Aldridge telegraphed me this morning. Tate is coming with a federal warrant for Holt's arrest and a team of 3 deputies. 4 days. After that, Holt has no leverage over anything." She let out a breath. "4 days. We stay here, we stay together, we stay careful, and we wait 4 days," Levy said. "That's all." She looked at him for a long moment, then she nodded slowly. "All right," she said. But Garrett Holt did not wait 4 days. On the morning of the 3rd day, the morning of what would become Levy and Adelaide's wedding day, though neither of them had known that the previous evening, Holt made his move. Not carefully, not with the precision he usually showed, but with the recklessness of a man who could feel his world closing around him and had decided that desperate action was better than waiting to be caught. He sent Dawes and 2 other men to the Zachary ranch at first light. Mrs. Acaffer saw them coming from the kitchen window and had the back door open and was moving before they reached the yard. Levy and Adelaide were already awake. Levy had been up before dawn with the particular unease of a man whose instincts were telling him something. And Adelaide had come down to find him at the kitchen table and had stayed. And Mrs. Acaffer's 3 sharp raps on the parlor door told them everything they needed to know. What happened next was fast and terrifying and, in its way, clarifying. Levy told Adelaide to take the documents and ride for the Hendersons' ranch. Adelaide refused. They had, in total, approximately 45 seconds of argument before Dawes and his men were at the front door, and in those 45 seconds, something happened between them that was outside the emergency entirely, something that was entirely them. "Go," Levy said. "Please." "I'm not leaving you here," Adelaide said. "Adelaide." "I am not leaving you," she said, and the way she said it made the emergency go slightly sideways for just a moment, because what she said was not only about the practical situation and they both knew it. "Then stay close to me," he said. "And do exactly what I say." "Mostly," she said. He almost smiled. The confrontation at the door was brief and ugly. Dawes had a warrant of dubious legitimacy, issued by a local judge who was in Holt's pocket, for the arrest of Adelaide Voss on charges of theft of private documents. Levy refused to admit them. Dawes forced the door. What followed was violent enough and brief enough and ultimately in Levy and Adelaide's favor, because Mrs. Okafor had sent one of the ranch hands for Frank Henderson an hour before dawn on the strength of the same instinct Levy had woken with, and Frank Henderson arrived with 4 men of his own just as Dawes was trying to take Adelaide out the back door. But Dawes, in the chaos, managed to get away. And he went directly to Holt. And Holt, who had been preparing for the possibility of the warrant being issued, and the possibility of arrest and the possibility of everything falling apart, had one piece of leverage he had not yet used. He had been watching the telegraph station and had a man inside it. He knew when Commissioner Aldridge had telegraphed Levy about Tate's arrival. He knew Tate was coming, and he knew he had one day. He took Adelaide himself. It happened in the town, not at the ranch, because Holt was smarter than Dawes and he knew that the ranch was no longer a safe approach. Adelaide had ridden into Rosalie Flats alone in the early afternoon, against Levy's wishes, firmly stated, and not unreasonably set aside by Adelaide on the grounds that there were things she needed to do, and she was not going to be imprisoned in the ranch house. To send a telegraph to Holloway confirming Tate's imminent arrival. She was halfway back to her horse when Holt's second man, the broad one with the broken nose, stepped out of the alley between the hardware store and the dry goods, and a cloth soaked in something chemical was pressed over her face before she had time to do more than twist sharply and get one solid kick into his shin. Levy knew she was in trouble before anyone told him. He had been uneasy since she left, and he had ridden into town 40 minutes after her, telling himself he was being overprotective and doing it anyway, because where Adelaide was concerned his instincts had been consistently right, and his attempts to manage them had been consistently insufficient. He found her horse tied at the telegraph station's hitching post and Adelaide nowhere in sight. He found the telegraph operator inside, white-faced and frightened, who said he had seen a woman who matched the description being put into a cart behind the station, unconscious, by 2 men, and that the cart had gone south toward the Old Verler Road. The Old Verler Road led to the abandoned telegraph station 4 miles south of town. Levy got there at a hard gallop, which is where we began, with a gun pressed to the back of his neck, and Adelaide bound to a post and Holt's face carrying the particular look of a man who has decided that fire is a reasonable response to a flood. The gun moved to Adelaide. The world stopped. And then Levy did the only thing that made sense, which was to stop calculating and act. He moved, fast and sideways, putting himself between the gun and Adelaide in the same instant. He grabbed the wrist of the broad man behind him, because he had been tracking the broad man's position by sound for the last 3 minutes, and he knew within 6 inches where the man's gun arm was. The struggle was brutal and brief. The gun went off into the ceiling. Plaster and dust fell. Holt, startled, took his aim off Adelaide for 1 second. The door of the telegraph station opened. Marshal Tate stepped through it, with 2 deputies behind him and the 3rd covering the back exit. He had arrived a day early. Tate was a very large, very quiet man with the face of a former soldier who had made peace with what he was willing to do. He looked at the room, Levy and the broad man in a struggle on the floor, Holt with a gun, Adelaide bound to the post, and said in a completely level voice, "Put the weapon down, Mr. Holt. This is over." Holt stood very still for 1 long moment. The gun was still in his hand. The calculation was visible in his face. The last calculation of a man deciding whether the outcome of fighting was better or worse than the outcome of surrendering. And then something in it resolved, and the gun came down. It was over. Not cleanly, and not without the weeks of formal proceedings that followed, but in all the ways that mattered in that dusty adobe room with plaster dust still falling from the ceiling. It was over. Tate arrested Holt and his 2 men. Dawes was apprehended at the edge of town by the 3rd deputy, who had been circling to prevent exactly that exit. The judge who had issued the fraudulent warrant for Adelaide's arrest was suspended pending a federal review. Silas Conover cooperated fully and immediately with the federal investigation, in the manner of a very frightened man who had been waiting for an opportunity to stop being frightened. Adelaide's hands were cut free. Levy was the one who cut them. He used his pocket knife, the one he had carried since he was 17, and he cut the rope, and then he held her hands in his for a moment because they were cold and because he needed to feel that they were whole. She looked at him. "You put yourself in front of the gun," she said. "You would have done the same," he said. "That isn't the point," she said. "I know," he said. She looked down at her hands in his. "You are a very difficult man to argue with," she said. "You still argue," he observed. "Of course I do," she said. "But I am finding it increasingly comfortable to argue with you specifically, and I am aware that that means something." "What does it mean?" he asked. She lifted her eyes to his. "It means," she said, "that I have a better understanding now of what you meant when you said what you said on the first day." "Which part?" he said. "About the horse." She gave him a look. "You know which part," she said. He did. He also knew that the moment had arrived for him to say what he had been thinking about since the tool shed at sunset, and the church steps in Santa Fe, and the 45 seconds of argument that morning that had clarified everything. "Adelaide," he said, and his voice was low and entirely serious, "I am not a man who does things without thinking them through, and I have thought this through. I would very much like you to stay, not as a guest and not as someone passing through on their way back to somewhere else. I would like you to stay because this place and I both have room for you, and because I think you know that, and because your father's work is going to take a long time to resolve, and someone should be here who cares about it the way you care about it." He paused. "And because I meant what I said at the fence," he said. "I meant it then, and I mean it more now." The light through the dusty window of the adobe station was late afternoon gold, the particular October gold of New Mexico that was different from any other gold in the world. It fell across Adelaide's face and her torn dress and her unbound hair and her honest brown eyes. "You meant the part about marrying," she said. "I meant the part about marrying," he confirmed. "Levy Zachary," she said. "That is still an extremely forward thing to say." "I know," he said. "But I find," she said slowly, "that I have developed a tolerance for forward honesty, possibly a preference for it." A pause. "My father's justice is in motion. Commissioner Aldridge and Marshal Tate will see it through. I have no plan beyond this moment." "I know," he said again. "Ask me properly," she said. He held her hands, both of them, cold from the rope and warming in his. He looked at her steadily and without theater. "Will you marry me?" he said. Adelaide Voss looked at him for a long, full moment in which everything that had happened in 3 weeks and in the whole of her life seemed to sit quietly in the air between them. And then she said, "Yes." Marshal Tate, who was leading Holt out of the station at that exact moment, said nothing. But he held the door open with a courtesy that was almost ceremonial. They were married 3 days later. Not hastily, but efficiently, because Adelaide was not a woman who needed a great deal of ceremony around something she had decided clearly, and Levy was not a man who needed performance. The reverend at the small church in Rosalie Flats, the one with the missing bell, which turned out to have fallen during a windstorm and been waiting for someone to rehang it, performed the ceremony on a Tuesday morning. Mrs. Ockafer wore her best dress, which was a deep green that suited her enormously, and she stood to Adelaide's left and gave her away with the air of someone who had decided approximately 7 minutes after meeting Adelaide that this outcome was appropriate, and had been waiting patiently for everyone else to arrive at the same conclusion. Frank Henderson and two of his men came and stood in the back, and Frank shook Levy's hand afterward with the grip of a man who was genuinely glad. Adelaide wore a blue dress she had bought in Santa Fe from a dressmaker on the main street, because she had brought nothing suitable to the territory for a wedding, and because blue suited her and she knew it. Levy wore his best shirt, which was white cotton and had been pressed by Mrs. Acaffer with the care of something being done for an important occasion. The Reverend said the words and Levy and Adelaide said the words back, looking at each other the whole time in the way of people who find the words less important than the fact of saying them to this particular person. "I will," Adelaide said. "I will," Levy said. Garrett Holt's trial was held in Santa Fe 6 weeks later and lasted 4 days. The evidence Edmund Voss had documented, combined with the records Holloway had preserved, and the testimony of the families who had been displaced from their land, was overwhelming. Holt was convicted of federal land fraud, conspiracy, and corruption charges. His holding company was dissolved. The fraudulent land transfers were voided. The 17 parcels began the process of being restored. It took time. It took the better part of 2 years in some cases, and the legal process was imperfect and bureaucratic and sometimes maddening. And Adelaide was involved in every step of it, because she had made herself an expert, and she refused to let the process get lost in administrative fog. The Jicarilla community to the north of the Zachary Ranch received their valley back. Adelaide rode up to speak with their leader in the spring of 1883, accompanied by Holloway and a territorial land attorney, and the meeting was formal and careful and respectful, and what was theirs was returned. Commissioner Aldridge's formal inquiry into Edmund Voss's death concluded that he had been given a substance that induced cardiac symptoms, and that 2 men in Holt's employ had been present at the time of his death. Those men were charged. The outcome of those charges was slower and less complete than Adelaide wanted and more complete than the first version of the inquiry had offered, which was nothing. She held her father's memory in the space between what was perfect and what was possible, and she did not let go of either. She wrote to her father's grave, at a small cemetery in Rosalie Flats, where he had been buried with the brief service of a man who had died among strangers, and placed wildflowers she had gathered from the mesa above the ranch. She did this in October, exactly 1 year after she had ridden onto Levy's land with a lame horse and a bleeding temple, and a mission that had consumed her for months. Levy went with her. He stood back a respectful distance while she placed the flowers and said whatever she said to her father in the privacy of her own heart. And when she stood and turned toward him, her eyes were bright with tears that she did not try to manage or conceal. He walked forward, and she came to meet him, and he put his arms around her right there in the October wind and held on, and she held back, and neither of them said anything because nothing needed to be said. The Zachary Ranch in the 2nd year of their marriage was a different place from what it had been when Adelaide arrived. Not in its bones, the land was the same red rock and dry grass and enormous sky, but in the way a place feels when it is fully inhabited by people who are fully present in it. Mrs. Acaffer stayed, as she had always intended to stay, and expanded the kitchen garden considerably in the spring of 1883, and taught Adelaide to preserve food for winter in the way of the region, which was different from how it was done in St. Louis. Adelaide learned and asked good questions, and occasionally did it wrong and laughed at herself when she did. She also continued her land advocacy work, writing detailed letters to Aldridge and to 2 federal representatives, and occasionally riding to Santa Fe for meetings that Levy drove her to without complaint and waited for outside with a book or a conversation with whoever else was waiting. Levy's brother Thomas wrote in the spring of 1883, a longer and less guarded letter than his previous ones, asking if the offer to come back to the ranch still stood. Levy wrote back and said yes immediately. Adelaide added a postscript to the letter in her precise handwriting that said she had heard a great deal about Thomas and looked forward to meeting him, which Thomas later said was the thing that made him decide to actually come rather than just consider it. Thomas arrived in June of 1883 and was, as Adelaide had expected, a man who shared certain qualities with his brother: the directness, the work ethic, the sense of humor that was dry and quiet and genuine, and certain qualities that were entirely his own. He was also, clearly, a man who had spent 2 years regretting the pride that had sent him east, and who was doing the careful, practical work of rebuilding the relationship he had damaged. He and Levy mended fences, literally and otherwise, through the summer. Adelaide watched this with the satisfaction of someone who understood the particular difficulty of love between siblings, and was glad to see it working toward health. Thomas, in his turn, observed his brother's marriage with the attention of a man who had not expected to find that Levy had changed, or rather that he had become more fully himself, and thought carefully about what Adelaide had done to the household, which was not to change it but to complete it. He told Levy this one evening in late summer, sitting on the porch in the blue dark with 2 cups of coffee. "She's good for you," Thomas said. "I know it," Levy said. "You're good for her too," Thomas said. "It's equal, that's rare." Levy thought about this. "I think," he said slowly, "that she was already who she was going to be when she arrived. I didn't make her anything, I just recognized it." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "That might be the most you've ever said at one time," he said. Levy looked at him. "Don't push it," he said. Thomas smiled, and they sat in the comfortable dark, and the night sounds of the Mesa country came in around them, the crickets and the wind and the distant call of an owl, and the ranch house was lit from inside where Adelaide was reading, the warm yellow glow of the lamp visible through the window, and everything felt, for once, entirely whole. Adelaide found out she was expecting in October of 1883, exactly 2 years after she had ridden onto Levy's land. She told him in the evening, sitting across from him at the kitchen table. In the direct and matter-of-fact way she delivered all information of significance. She watched his face and saw it go through something she had only seen in it a few times, the complete dissolution of his usual reserve. "Are you all right?" she asked, because the expression was unreadable in its intensity. "I'm very well," he said, and his voice was rough. "I'm quite extraordinarily well." She reached across the table and took his hand. He held it with both of his. Mrs. Acaffer, who was in the kitchen and had heard every word, said, "I'll make a celebration supper," in a tone that was pure controlled joy. Their son was born in June of 1884, healthy and loud and immediately opinionated, which Adelaide said was entirely predictable, and Levy privately thought boded extremely well. They named him Edmund Levy Zachary, after both the men whose determination had made his existence possible. Thomas, who had been in the house and had spent 6 hours in the parlor with his hands clasped and his knee bouncing, came into the room when Levy called him and saw his nephew for the first time, red-faced and furious with the indignity of newness, and said, "Oh," in a voice that was completely stripped of any pretension, and reached out one careful finger and touched the baby's hand, and the baby's hand, after a moment, closed around the finger. Adelaide, watching from the bed where she was exhausted and triumphant, said, "He does that to everyone. He's very decisive." "Takes after his mother," Levy said. "And his grandfather," she said more quietly. "And his grandfather," Levy agreed. Edmund was 6 months old, and had recently discovered that his hands belonged to him when Adelaide received a letter from Commissioner Aldridge. She read it at the breakfast table, Edmund on her knee, and then read it again. Aldridge has been asked to produce a comprehensive report on the land fraud cases in this territory for the federal legislature, she said. He wants to include my father's documentation as the primary evidence base. He's asking my permission, and he's asking if I would be willing to have my father's name formally cited as the source. She set the letter down. Levy waited. Edmund Voss, land surveyor, cited in federal legislative record, she said. She looked at her son, who was examining his own fist with extreme concentration. Your grandfather's name is going to be in the record, she told him. People will know what he did. Edmund paid no attention to this, being entirely occupied with his fist, but Adelaide said it to him anyway. She wrote back to Aldridge that day, giving her permission and asking that the citation read not only Edmund Voss's name but his profession and his county, so that the documentation would be specific and placed in its context. Aldridge honored this. Life on the Zachary Ranch moved the way good lives move, not without difficulty, but with a quality of forward motion and solidity that made difficulty manageable rather than devastating. There were hard winters and a bad drought year in 1885 that threatened the grass and required careful rationing of the water, and the sale of part of the cattle herd that Levy made calmly, and without crisis, because calm was how he operated under pressure. There were good years and growing years, years when the ranch expanded and years when it contracted, and through all of it, the marriage was the constant, the place that held. They argued with some frequency, because Adelaide had opinions and Levy had principles, and they did not always align on the first pass, and both of them were constitutionally incapable of pretending agreement they did not feel. But they had learned, fairly early, the difference between arguing about the thing and arguing about each other, and they stayed on the right side of that distinction with the care of people who understood what they had. You're going to give in eventually, Adelaide said on a Tuesday in the spring of 1886, regarding the argument about whether they needed a second water pump for the south field. I might, Levy said. Or you might. I won't, she said. I've looked at the soil moisture data for the last 3 years, and the south field needs consistent supplemental water in July or the yield drops by 1/3. That is not an opinion, it is a measurement. Levy looked at her. When did you do soil moisture measurements? I've been doing them since October, she said. I have a notebook. He sat with this for a moment. Show me, he said. She showed him. He studied the notebook, which was meticulous in the same way her father's notebooks had been meticulous, and said, We'll get the pump. Adelaide did not say, I told you so, because she was not that kind of person, and also because it was more satisfying to be right than to point it out. Their daughter arrived in the spring of 1887, announced with the same abruptness and conviction that had characterized most things Adelaide did. She was born on a rainy April morning that smelled of wet sage and clean stone, and she was smaller than Edmund had been and quieter, with her mother's brown eyes and her father's expression of deep, considering attention. They named her Clara, after Adelaide's mother. Clara Voss had been a woman who had, by all accounts, lived with both joy and principle and had passed both to her daughter, and Adelaide wanted the name to continue. Thomas, by now thoroughly embedded in the ranch and also thoroughly in love with a young woman named Dorothy, who was the daughter of the Presbyterian minister in Rosalie Flats and who matched Thomas in both stubbornness and warmth, held Clara for approximately 3 minutes at her first introduction, and then handed her back to Adelaide and said, She looks like she's already thinking about something. All of them do, Mrs. Acaffer said from across the room. This family is constitutionally incapable of being unthoughtful. Mrs. Acaffer said this as a compliment. It was received as one. The town of Rosalie Flats itself was changing. Without Holt's money and pressure distorting its governance, the town had moved slowly but perceptibly toward something more accountable. A new sheriff had been elected in 1884, a straight-dealing man from Colorado named Davies, who was neither bought nor frightened. The land office had new staff and new oversight. Silas Conover, freed from the fear that had made him a reluctant informant for Holt, had expanded his hotel and seemed, for the first time in anyone's memory, to actually enjoy running it. The families whose land had been restored came back, some of them, and those who could not come back sent their children. The Henderson family, who had lost a cousin's claim and recovered it, threw a party in the fall of 1884 to which they invited the Zacharys and half the county. And Frank Henderson stood up and said that he had seen a good many things in 40 years in this territory, and that the recovery of honest land governance was among the best. Adelaide spoke at that gathering. She had been asked to, and she did it with the particular combination of precision and passion that was her way, the facts of what her father had documented, the number of families affected, the federal precedent the case had established. She spoke about her father without sentimentality and without reserve, and when she was done there was a silence that was not empty but full, the kind of silence that people offer when they want a thing to land properly. Levy sat beside her, and when she sat down he took her hand under the table, and she turned her hand over and held his back, and that was all. Edmund was 5 in 1889, old enough to begin following his father around the ranch, with the comprehensive seriousness of a small person, convinced he has important work to do. Levy taught him about the horses with the patience he brought to everything, kneeling down to explain the names of things, what the farrier did, and why, how to read a horse's mood by its ears and its weight. Adelaide watched these lessons from the fence and felt something she did not have a word for, which was the particular fullness of seeing the people you love in their best selves. She had written a long letter to Holloway in Santa Fe the previous year, detailing a case she had identified in a neighboring county that had the structural signatures of the same kind of fraud her father had exposed. Holloway had passed it to Aldridge. Aldridge was investigating. Adelaide had become, without entirely planning to, something that the Federal Land Office referenced when they had questions about documentation integrity in this part of the territory. She was not an official anything. She held no title, carried no formal authority. She was a rancher's wife in Rosalie Flats, New Mexico, with 2 children and a notebook full of soil measurements and the handwriting of a woman who had learned precision from her father. She was also a woman whose letters moved investigations and whose knowledge of land law in this territory was more thorough than most of the officials who administered it. "You should go back to school," Levy said one evening, not for the first time. "There's no law school in New Mexico," Adelaide said, not for the first time. "There will be," he said. "Or you go to Colorado or you go to Santa Fe when the territories develop their institutions. You already know more than most of the lawyers I've watched operate in that land office." Adelaide looked at him over Clara's head. Their daughter was asleep on her chest, a warm, decisive weight. "Are you trying to send me away?" she said, and the lightness in her voice told him she knew the answer. "I'm trying to give you everything you should have," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "You do," she said. "You already do." There was a simplicity to what passed between them in moments like this that was the result of years. Not the simplicity of people who had never had complexity, but the simplicity of people who had worked through the complexity and arrived somewhere clear and solid on the other side. In the fall of 1890, 8 years after Adelaide had ridden onto Levy's land with a lame horse and a mission, and a question about whether he always helped strangers, she stood at the fence line where he had first seen her and looked out over the same dry grass and red rock and enormous sky. The fence was different. He had replaced most of it over the years, but the view was the same. Edmund was behind her, chasing the dog through the yard with the total commitment of a 6-year-old who has no concept of doing anything halfway. Clara was in the house with Mrs. Acaffer, learning to make bread, which she approached with the same considering attention she brought to everything. Thomas and Dorothy were at their own house now, a new house on the western section of the ranch that Thomas had built over the course of a summer, and Dorothy was expecting their first child in the spring, and the world was expanding in the way of healthy living things. Levy came to stand beside Adelaide at the fence. She felt him before she heard him, the particular shift of air and attention that was his presence, as familiar to her now as her own heartbeat. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The first day," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He knew which day she meant. "You were bleeding and your horse was lame and you were still worrying about the horse before yourself," he said. "She was the one in pain," Adelaide said. "You had a cut on your temple. It was shallow." He looked at her sideways. "You are the most impossible person to worry about," he said, "because you are always logical about your own injuries and absolutely unwilling to be logical about anyone else's." "That's accurate," she agreed. He leaned on the fence post next to her, his shoulder against hers, and they looked out over the land that was theirs, and that was exactly right for what they were and what they had made together. "I meant it, by the way," he said. "What I said that first day." She turned to look at him. "I know you did," she said. "I knew it when you said it, actually. I just needed to be sure that you knew it. And now." She looked at his face, which she knew better than she knew any other face in the world, and which still, occasionally, offered her something new to learn, a particular expression in a particular light. The way he looked at their children, the way he had looked at her in the church in Santa Fe when she had come out after sitting with her grief and found him there with coffee. "Now," she said, "I know it the way I know everything I'm absolutely certain of, the way I know the soil measurements and the land law in my father's handwriting." She paused. "The way I know that this is home." He put his arm around her and she leaned into his side. And the October wind came in off the mesa with its particular quality of belonging. And Edmund shouted something across the yard about the dog, and everything was exactly what it was supposed to be. She asked him, once much later, years later, on a quiet evening when the children were older and the house was sometimes peacefully quiet in a way it had not been for a decade, whether he had really meant it. The morning at the fence line. The declaration with the lame horse and the bleeding stranger. Had he truly known, or had it been one of those things a person says in a strange moment that turns out to be more right than they intended? Levy thought about it with the seriousness he brought to things he thought deserved a real answer. "I think," he said slowly, "that I didn't know the word for what I knew. I just knew that the thing in front of me was something I should not let pass. The way you know, sometimes, that a thing is significant before you have the language for why." Adelaide considered this. "A rancher's instinct," she said. "A human one," he said. She was quiet for a moment, considering. "My father used to say that the most important decisions a person makes are not made by calculation," she said. "They're made by a kind of recognition. You recognize a right thing and then you spend the rest of your time catching up to what you already knew." "He sounds like he was a wise man," Levy said. "He was," she said. "He would have said what you said to me that day was reckless." "Probably," Levy agreed. "And then he would have said it was also correct," she said. because he was practical and principled, and sometimes those two things pointed in the same direction. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, the same table where she had first sat 8 years ago with cold coffee and a bleeding temple, and the careful, guarded assessment of a woman who had learned to be careful and was figuring out whether it was safe not to be. The house was quiet and warm. The lamp on the table cast a circle of yellow light. Levy sat down across from her, the same chair, the same table. "You're glad you stayed," he said. It was not quite a question. She looked at him with the full directness that was her defining quality, the thing that had not changed in 8 years and that he had loved first and longest about her. "Every day," she said simply. "Even the days when we argue about the water pumps," he said. "Especially those days," she said. "Because those days I was right." He looked at her, and the warmth that had been in his chest since the first October evening in the tool shed was there exactly as it had always been, unchanged by familiarity, which was the thing about the right person. They did not become ordinary. They became more known, which was different. "I love you," he said, the way he said most important things, plainly and without decoration. "I know," she said, with the particular smile that had started as almost smile on the first day and had long since become full and unguarded and completely his. "I love you too." Outside, the New Mexico sky was doing what it always did in October, burning orange and red above the mesa, indifferent and magnificent. The fence that Levy had been mending when Adelaide had first appeared on the ridge was mended, and re-mended now, solid against whatever weather came. The mare that had carried her across the territory with a lame leg was long retired to an easy life in the pasture. The papers her father had hidden in the spine of a book were in the federal record in Washington now, cited in legislation that had changed the land law in 3 territories. Edmund Voss's name was in the record. The families on the list had their land. Garrett Holt was serving a federal sentence in a prison in Colorado and had not been relevant to anything in years. And in the kitchen of the Zachary Ranch, in the circle of lamplight, 2 people who had been strangers on a fence line and who had become, through honesty and courage and the willingness to recognize a right thing and hold on to it, the most known people in each other's lives, sat across a table and were entirely home,